In 1965, dozens of thousands of American soldiers are bound for war in Vietnam. Supported by B-52 bombers, helicopters, and napalm, many anticipate the Viet Cong guerrillas will collapse before overwhelming U.S. firepower. Instead, amid Vietnam's jungles and swamps, the Americans find fighting to be a grueling slog that exacts heavy casualties and rarely allows them to strike first. In the summer of 1965, 50,000 U.S. troops deployed to South Vietnam under Military Assistance Command Vietnam, MACV. Washington hopes American soldiers and aerial might will coerce North Vietnam to withdraw its backing for the Viet Cong insurgency, undermining the South Vietnamese government. Nonetheless, the U.S. response will be cautious and primarily aerial. By late 1964, the United States had already been secretly striking North Vietnamese supply routes in neighboring Laos, and in 1965, North Vietnam is targeted as part of Operation Rolling Thunder. Yet the U.S. largely attacks secondary objectives, not Hanoi, to pressure North Vietnam into talks favorable to the South. In this respect, President Lyndon B. Johnson is not seeking a traditional territorial or absolute victory, but preventing a North Vietnamese triumph over his southern allies. North Vietnam insists no talks can begin while foreign troops remain in South Vietnam. Thus, combat rather than compromise appears to be the default in Vietnam. U.S. General William Westmoreland must devise a strategy to drive the North from South Vietnam at a minimal cost to the United States, both politically and militarily. This is difficult because political limits require his ground war to be confined almost entirely within South Vietnam. Johnson rules out any full-scale invasion of North Vietnam, since it would likely trigger Chinese intervention, as happened during the Korean War. The president also rejects cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Laos and Cambodia because he wants to restrict ground operations. This, however, will complicate Westmoreland's effort to isolate the theater of operations. American planning narrows to two main approaches in South Vietnam: conventional large-scale combat, or counterinsurgency centered on small unit actions and the political pacification of South Vietnamese civilians. Though counterinsurgency has adherents, Westmoreland argues it would demand more forces and surrender initiative to the Viet Cong. Instead, he plans to exploit U.S. advantages in mobility and firepower through a strategy of annihilation. He intends to take the fight to the Viet Cong, destroy them in major unit engagements, and inflict such heavy losses that North Vietnam cannot sustain the insurgency. It is a swift attritional approach. To meet objectives, U.S. forces will not aim to hold terrain permanently, but will conduct search and destroy missions as required. This is going to be a methodical search, house by house, village by village, as we move north. This small group of huts here shelters some of the Vietnamese families. We're searching mainly today for military age, men who might possibly be VC. So far, all we can see are women and children and old men. The plan accompanies an institutional shift within the Department of Defense. Under Secretary Robert McNamara, the DoD adopts statistical and quantitative management techniques drawn from business. Every aspect of the war is measured to evaluate progress and identify when North Vietnam reaches the critical tipping point at which it can no longer sustain the campaign. Analysts and officers tally everything from bomb tonnage to tent pegs, yet the most crucial indicator becomes the body count of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong killed during U.S. operations. Since the U.S. will not judge progress by territory gained in the same manner as many conventional wars, the body count becomes the primary means of assessing success. The Pentagon, therefore, pushes U.S. commanders to drive up kill and capture figures as a way to realize Westmoreland's strategy. The American kill count emphasis expands the original protective role of U.S. forces, for now they are to undertake offensive patrols and bring the fight to the Viet Cong, and they will do so backed by new firepower. These included artillery barrages, close air support from tactical fighters, increased use of helicopter air assaults, and massed B-52 strikes, tools intended to overwhelm enemy formations, but which often wreaked havoc on villages, infrastructure, and the relationship between Americans and Vietnamese civilians. In an ideal search and destroy operation, U.S. troops would first locate a Viet Cong unit through intelligence and reconnaissance, then swiftly deploy ground forces to pin the enemy in place. As the fighting escalates and draws in more opponents, American troops would call for airstrikes and artillery to annihilate them. Similar operations had been previously attempted by the ARVN, but U.S. commanders believed those efforts failed not because of flawed tactics, but due to the South Vietnamese forces' inferior combat performance. To strengthen their campaign, American troops received new weapons, vehicles, and equipment. Beginning in 1964, the U.S. Army adopted the 5.56mm M16 rifle to replace the older 7.62mm M14. The transition was controversial, but the M16's lighter weight, better control during automatic fire, and higher ammunition capacity were considered essential advantages in the dense jungles of Vietnam, where engagements were close range and resupply difficult. Combined with the M60 machine gun and M79 Thumper grenade launcher, U.S. platoons expected to unleash overwhelming firepower against the more lightly equipped Viet Cong. Perhaps the platoon's most crucial tool was the radio, allowing them to summon artillery or air support at a moment's notice. Since much of South Vietnam was covered by thick jungle, mountains, or flooded deltas, movement by land was slow and dangerous. To overcome this, a brown water navy of patrol boats and hovercraft patrolled rivers, while a new fleet of military helicopters revolutionized mobility. Chief among them was the UH-1 Iroquois, or Huey, which replaced the bulky Shawnee and became the iconic machine of the Vietnam War. Used for troop insertions, evacuations, resupply, and fire missions, Hueys accounted for nearly a third of the 36 million helicopter sorties flown during the conflict. At the same time, jet aircraft like the F-4 Phantom and A-4 Skyhawk delivered devastating close air support with napalm and white phosphorus, while the AC-47 Spooky gunship, armed with multiple miniguns, could circle overhead for hours, blanketing enemy positions in continuous fire. Helicopters quickly proved their value in combat. During the Battle of Ia Drang in November 1965, airmobile troops inflicted severe losses on North Vietnamese regulars crossing from Cambodia. Despite the NVA's close-range assaults on American landing zones, overwhelming U.S. firepower drove them back, including the first tactical deployment of B-52 bombers. Although most of the NVA force managed to retreat, the U.S. 1st Air Cavalry Division reported a 10-to-1 kill ratio, seemingly validating helicopter assault tactics and Westmoreland's overall strategy. Early in the war, the presence of helicopters also had a powerful psychological effect on North Vietnamese troops. As one soldier, Nguyen Quang Sung, recalled, "When helicopters spotted us, we had to run for our lives. It was terrifying. Once, when a helicopter dropped especially close, I even saw the face of the door gunner. That was the first time I ever saw an American. I'm still haunted by it in my nightmares." Appy Patriots, 216. By late 1965, the United States could claim to have halted the South's collapse and brought the war to the enemy. Yet the Viet Cong were already adapting. The punishment suffered at Ia Drang pushed the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong to return to guerrilla warfare, partly out of necessity, but also from a shrewd grasp of U.S. politics. General Secretary Le Duan understood that America's greatest weakness lay not in the field, but in its lack of political endurance at home. We can fight a protracted war, while the U.S. cannot. Though America can send 300,000 or even 400,000 troops at once, why must it do so step by step? Because they expect a long war and fear the growing opposition of both the American public and international opinion. Ruan 1-10. The North Vietnamese leadership decides the Viet Cong will take the initiative in the South, using the same tactics that once proved successful against the ARVN. In 1963, U.S. General Frank Osmansky summarized Viet Cong methods. VC non-explosive weapons include caltrops, spike traps, poisoned darts, and even enraged water buffaloes. In a sense, their endurance, patience, and ingenuity are also weapons, for they have been known to live for weeks in dark tunnels, to remain underwater for long periods breathing through hollow reeds, and to lie in ambush for as long as 48 hours. Langer 75. Sniping, mines, and booby traps now become the Viet Cong's primary tools of attack. Mines are especially favored because they wound as often as they kill, draining U.S. manpower, morale, and medical resources. The Viet Cong also become masters of ambush warfare, often striking quickly at officers and radio men to cut communications and prevent air support. Most of these engagements last only a few minutes. Their tactics rely on simple but efficient logistics. A typical Viet Cong fighter carries as little as 5 kilograms of equipment, compared to up to 40 for a U.S. soldier. The North Vietnamese also draw supplies from local villages, whether through sympathy or coercion, and blend easily into the civilian population. Civilians and irregulars assist by laying mines, transporting supplies, or scavenging unexploded American ordnance for reuse. Extensive tunnel networks, some even running beneath U.S. bases, allow the Viet Cong to move undetected, store weapons, and shield personnel from bombardment. Alongside them operates the Regular People's Army of Vietnam, or North Vietnamese Army, NVA. With strict political control, conscription, and constant propaganda, the NVA expands rapidly, equipped with modern Soviet and Chinese arms. Soon, NVA units can rival American platoons in firepower, armed with AK-47 rifles, RPD machine guns, and rocket-propelled grenades. The Viet Cong, though sometimes still equipped with WPI-era weapons, receive updated arms and supplies through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Soviet Union and China also bolster North Vietnam's defenses by sending engineers, anti-aircraft units, and modern fighter aircraft such as MiG-21s. North Vietnamese ace Lu Hui Chau later recalled his psychological edge over U.S. pilots. Once I had shot down an F-4, I was no longer afraid of any kind of American plane. The psychological factor is vital in any battle. Part of my confidence came from knowing that if I had to bail out, I would be landing in my own country. Appy Patriots, 214. North Vietnamese strategy emphasizes striking only under favorable conditions. Through patience and surprise, they frequently neutralize American technological superiority. Despite the dominance of helicopters in news coverage, the reality of combat in Vietnam remains overwhelmingly low-tech. One major reason is that helicopters are both expensive and highly vulnerable targets. As the war progresses, the North Vietnamese become adept at ambushing or shooting them down. Their loud rotor blades make stealth impossible, allowing the Viet Cong to set traps around landing zones using RPGs and heavy machine guns. When the troops leaped from the lead choppers, the entire tree line erupted with small arms fire. A machine gun opened up from the hillside north of the LZ, pouring deadly fire into the helicopters. The rounds smashed through the plexiglass cockpits. The bird rolled over like a great wounded bull elephant, its rotor blades still spinning as they hacked into the ground. Langer 126. The United States would lose nearly 5,000 helicopters over the course of the war, about half to enemy fire. To limit such losses, helicopter pilots began dropping troops at safer landing zones, forcing soldiers to undertake long, often multi-week jungle patrols, known among GIs as humping the boonies. In these harsh conditions, the Viet Cong were only one of many enemies. Wildlife, mosquitoes, tropical diseases, exhaustion, and dehydration all took their toll on American troops. With only about 1% of patrols encountering direct enemy contact, mines and booby traps were often the most feared hazards, accounting for nearly a quarter of all casualties. One 19-year-old soldier described it vividly. It's an absurd combination of certainty and uncertainty. The certainty that you're walking in minefields, passing the same spots day after day, and the uncertainty of every step, of how you shift your weight, of where you dare to sit. Appy WCW 171. When combat did occur, it was almost always the Viet Cong who initiated it. A 1966 report estimated that the North Vietnamese started around 79% of all engagements. They quickly learned how to anticipate the timing of American air support, withdrawing before airstrikes arrived or engaging so close that supporting fire risked hitting U.S. troops as well. By 1968, as much as 15 to 20% of American casualties resulted from friendly fire. As you come into a village, you always get this sniper fire. It never fails. and we inevitably take casualties now and then. We return fire, but by the time we reach the village, the VC are gone and it's very difficult, very frustrating for us. American weapons, meanwhile, often struggled in Vietnam's jungle environment, especially the M16 rifle. A 1965 study reported 10.5 malfunctions per 1,000 rounds fired. The M16's lightweight materials proved sensitive to ammunition propellant changes and poor cleaning, and many soldiers arrived in Vietnam with no prior training on the weapon. Eventually, the Pentagon improved the design with corrosion-resistant parts and better maintenance instruction. By 1968, malfunction rates fell to about 3.8 per 1,000 rounds, and serious ejection failures dropped to 0.32. Still, the M16's early poor reputation endured, especially among Marines. The M60 machine gun had a similar mix of admirers and critics. When working properly, its high volume of fire boosted morale and proved versatile, particularly when mounted on helicopters. But its reliability deteriorated quickly with heavy use, and spare parts were scarce. The weapon's rapid rate of fire also forced riflemen to carry heavy belts of 7.62 cm ammunition and spare barrels. Altogether, the combination of physical strain, constant danger, and the inability to strike back bred deep frustration among soldiers. You go out on patrol 20 times or more, and nothing, just nothing. Then, the 21st time, zap, 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 you get hit, and Victor Charlie melts back into the jungle before you can reach him. Lawrence TVW 107. American troops in Vietnam faced many additional pressures. Roughly 1 in 4 were draftees, conscripts, and their average age was only 19. Few units deployed together as intact formations. Instead, most arrived as individuals or small groups. Frequent officer turnover and short one-year tours meant that hard-earned combat experience was constantly lost and had to be relearned by new arrivals. The strain of combat, the elusiveness of the enemy, and peer pressure all contributed, though could never excuse, the growing instances of American violence against Vietnamese civilians. As the war dragged on, civilians increasingly suffered from injury, displacement, and destruction of property, both deliberate and accidental, at the hands of U.S., ARVN, and Allied troops. Hostility, or at least indifference, from many villagers led some GIs to assume they supported the Viet Cong. In many cases, they were right. Even a South Vietnamese government report estimated that 5 million of the nation's 17 million people sympathized with or aided the insurgency. This realization eroded U.S. soldiers' faith in the mission and deepened their sense of futility and detachment, to the suffering of the locals. Marine officer Philip Caputo was among those who lost faith. When we first marched into the rice paddies, we carried with us not just packs and rifles, but also the deep belief that we were part of something noble and right. The packs and rifles we kept. The beliefs we lost. Caputo. American reprisals against civilians often stemmed from anger over casualties and frustration at their inability to strike effectively at the Viet Cong. In 1967, State Department official Daniel Ellsberg joined a patrol that destroyed a civilian house. Their urge to burn the house came partly from frustration and partly because they simply didn't know what else might work. Dappy 193. South Vietnamese civilians suffered violence from both sides. As the war escalated in 1965, the Viet Cong's weakening support base led them to rely increasingly on coercion and intimidation to secure recruits, supplies, and intelligence. Villagers who interacted with U.S. or ARVN troops risked accusations of betrayal. Lalai Hayslip, a South Vietnamese villager, was attacked by the Viet Cong after her loyalty was questioned. She later wrote, "Over time, our fear of the Viet Cong became almost as great as our fear of the Republicans. If the Republicans were elephants trampling through our village, the Viet Cong were snakes striking in the dark. At least you can see an elephant coming and step aside." Langer, 198-109. The psychological toll and tactical conditions on the ground meant that by 1967, the war had reached a stalemate. While U.S. troops inflicted heavy losses when engaging the enemy directly, the nature of the conflict was grinding them down. North Vietnam's strategy of attrition proved more effective. Yet General Westmoreland maintained, at least publicly, that the U.S. was making progress. By 1967, there were 485,600 U.S. troops in Vietnam, and Westmoreland requested even more. Large-scale search and destroy missions like Operation Cedar Falls and Junction City seemed to support his optimism, with U.S. forces claiming 2,000 enemy killed and only 242,000 Viet Cong fighters remaining. The truth, however, was far murkier. Massey V's data was deeply flawed. The obsession with body counts as a measure of success led officers to inflate numbers, sometimes doubling them, or to classify civilian dead as Viet Cong under the cynical rule, if it's dead and Vietnamese, it's VC. Quantifiable data took precedence over less measurable factors such as morale, ideology, or local sentiment, fostering the belief that, if it can't be counted, it doesn't matter. This mindset ignored key aspects of counterinsurgency and reduced a complex socio-political war to misleading statistics. Moreover, U.S. assessments underestimated North Vietnam's capacity to absorb losses. McVie failed to grasp that the North viewed the war as a total people's struggle for unification. The CIA, critical of these flawed assumptions, estimated as many as 600,000 enemy forces in South Vietnam in 1967, with 200,000 new recruits reaching draft age annually. The U.S. bombing campaign, too, failed to deliver results. Operation Rolling Thunder destroyed 59% of North Vietnam's power stations and 75% of its oil reserves. Yet this had minimal impact on a largely rural, unmechanized society. Air raids were also costly. By 1967, each dollar of damage inflicted cost the U.S. $9.50. Instead of weakening Hanoi, the bombing and inflated body counts eroded American morale and international support. Across the globe, from Sweden to India to Japan, public sympathy increasingly leaned toward North Vietnam's resistance. In late 1967, Westmoreland and President Johnson launched a public relations campaign to reassure Americans of their progress in Vietnam. "The ranks of the Viet Cong are thinning," Westmoreland proclaimed. "The end begins to come into view." Appy WCW 166. The opening months of 1968 would prove him catastrophically mistaken. Sponsorship. The Vietnam War stands as the most famous hot conflict of the Cold War, an era when the superpowers avoided direct combat out of fear of nuclear escalation. Though they came perilously close during the Cuban Missile Crisis only a few years earlier. As nuclear arsenals grew, the Soviet Union also pursued its vision of nuclear-powered communism, rapidly expanding reactor production. Entire cities were built to house an atomic elite driving this dream of limitless energy. One such city was Pripyat. If you'd like to learn more about the Soviet nuclear project, from its World War II origins to the Chernobyl disaster and beyond, you can watch our exclusive series Red Atoms on Nebula, the streaming platform created by independent educational creators. At Nebula.tv, our real-time history, you can get 40% off an annual subscription. For just $30 a year, you can watch Red Atoms and other Nebula originals like The Battle of Britain by Real Engineering. Nebula also includes creator-led classes, like our behind-the-scenes guide to producing a real-time history documentary. And, of course, you can watch all our videos ad-free and often earlier than on YouTube. If you want to support us and the vision behind Nebula, consider the lifetime membership this December. It helps us fund more in-depth historical documentaries we couldn't make on YouTube. All sources for this episode are listed in the video description. If you're watching on Patreon or Nebula, thank you for your support. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is a production of Real Time History, the only history channel that doesn't need to inflate its body count.